you have a right as an audience to know the veracity of the person who is speaking to you. How come this person has been asked, what's the background? You never find out. Jeff is a wonderful guy, but I didn't say enough about it. She wouldn't know who I was or what the reason I had to be here. So it forces the speaker to have to tell you, and that's embarrassing. But you gotta have to, because you gotta know who I am. I am a distinguished teaching professor, one of the 60 in New York State's system. Okay, this should be told by somebody else, but I'm telling you, that's who I am. Emerita from the college. I am a distinguished woman of New York State, so granted by the governor. I am a lady of the Equestrian Order of the Catholic Church, appointed by the Pope. Shall I continue? I've got a lot of credentials, folks, and I'm telling you this because you have reason to listen to me, because I know more than you do about this subject. And a lot of other things probably, but particularly this subject, the history of the city. And so it's important that you know that. So I'm not talking to you off the top of my head or out of the air or anything like that. I know what I'm talking about. And what I'm going to talk about is very important to you if you're going to assume the positions that you are being recognized for as the leadership of tomorrow. I can tell by looking around that some of you are leaders right now, and that's fine. But this is what you're here for. And so I want to tell you why that's important here, especially in Oswego, and what it takes to be a leader. The only reason they ask me is I am one. And I'll tell you why. It's very easy to be a leader. Most people don't realize it's very easy to be a leader, because nobody else wants to be one, for one thing. So if you're willing to step in at the head of the committee, you always can be a leader. But what being a leader is really, is looking around you, wherever you live, and there's always things, it doesn't matter how big or small the place is looking around and deciding what needs to be done that you can do. And you will always find in your community many things that need to be done and recognized. And I've had the opportunity, because to do these things here, nobody else ever thought of it. When I moved here, my husband was a native Oswegonian, and we inherited the house, and so I was happy to live here. I've always admired Oswego. I was born in Baldwinsville, and so we used to come down here. My father was fond of the days when retreat took place at the fort. Now, not the British that were retreating. I don't mean the next segment of retreat. But he would like to come down and see that on Sunday afternoons, and so I was familiar, very familiar, as a matter of fact, with this community and with the stories of the river, the Pathfinder, and all that. I assumed when I moved here that everybody else was. Well, surprise, surprise. Everybody that I ran into in Oswego, everybody in the early days, thought that the city began in 1848 when the Irish came over after the potato famine. That left out the 200 years that had preceded that, including the War of 1812, the French and Indian War, the settlement by the Jesuits, the Congregation of the Indians, the trapping facilities, and all the history that went with that. Nobody knew anything about it. They did not know anything about it. I'm not making this up. They didn't. I couldn't understand it. My father did. He told me all about these things as we would come up and go. My husband knew a little, but not a lot. And there was not a thing mentioned in the school. So I thought, this is terrible, because this is a very important place, and it should be thought of and recognized that way. My first job, that I recognized anyway as a need, was appointed to serve on the board of the Port of Oswego Authority. And I sat at a meeting one day and looked across the river at the recently evacuated building, which had been the Port Authority building. It was still owned by the port on the west side, where of course it is now. And I thought, that would be a marvelous place to have a marine museum. Oswego, of all places on the Great Lakes, should have a marine museum. So I brought it up in the meeting. And the chairman said, that's a wonderful idea, Rosemary, you be chairman. So that's how you get to be a leader. I was delighted he said that, because I wanted to do it by myself. I didn't want anybody butting in. I knew more about it than they did. I didn't want to tell me things, and I hate committees. Hate committees! Listen, I taught 40 years as a college professor. Do you think I don't know about meetings? Oh my God. And there's nobody worse than college people, believe me. Nobody. When I was teaching at Syracuse University, University, a nice woman was in the department. But I'll never forget, we'd go to the meeting, all of us, grimly, go to the department meetings, because she was the first to speak always, and she would start out by saying, Mr. Dean. That used to drive me crazy. You don't call the dean Mr. Dean. But she did. She would start, and she would go on and on and on about all the things that were wrong at the university. Now, this type of thing you're subjected to by many people on committees. If you've served on a committee, you know that. There's always one. Sometimes, unfortunately, more than that. We have a problem with that right now, and I don't care. I tell them what I think and call them by name and tell stories about them. I've been here. Age does that for you. We've got some people on the Common Council who should go because they only want to talk, and what they talk about is stupid. And so they should be gotten rid of. Sorry. Next time Ed Harrington comes to my door, I'm going to tell him. He knows how I feel. You just can't do it, folks. You can't be still. That's not being polite, that's being scared. Just stop this nonsense. It's just ridiculous. And the city has been subjected to criticism and fun poked at it now long enough. So we need to turn a corner on this. And part of it is choosing people who are equipped for leadership. Now, it means that you have to be confident of what you think and what needs to be done to correct it. I had nothing but cooperation when I started that museum, the Ashley White Marine Museum. I spoke to people and they said, well, yes, this or that is in my attic. You're welcome to it. I couldn't pay for anything. Everything you see down there when you go, with the exception of one of the canoes, everything else is a gift. All here. All reposing in people's attics and nobody knowing what to do about it. Thank God they didn't throw them away. But nobody getting together and saying, hey, we ought to do something about it. This is the oldest, folks, the oldest fresh water, pay attention, fresh water port in the United States. The oldest, Oswego is. You don't think that deserves some recognition in the form of a museum or some kind of historical representation? Of course it does. They've got a museum out in Cleveland, the Museum of the Great Lakes, and they've got another one further west, Duluth. Come on, those are fine, but they're not the old ones. This is. And everything of great importance in the early years of this country was reflected in one way or another here. Now, I'm going to tell you some of these things because it seems to me it's the responsibility of people who lead to know what they're leading. You should know something about this community, the depth of it, the background, and the kind of people who were here in very troubled and difficult times and nevertheless devoted themselves to it. It started in the 17th century. Here we go again. I became city historian mainly because I was yammering away about all this, and so somebody decided that's what I should do, be the city historian. There were city historians before me, and what they did was answer letters of people with genealogical requests. I don't want to do genealogy. It's too time-consuming, and I'm not interested in doing somebody else's genealogy. There is a very nice woman in the community who does it, so I turn the letters over to her. But nobody had done anything, previous city historians, about the things I'm going to talk about. Not a soul. They didn't even mention them. So when I started to put that together, I thought, well, what we've got to do is talk about the great moments in Oswego history, never mind the genealogy. You can do it yourself nowadays on a computer, for that matter. You don't need to hire somebody. So I looked around. In 1654, two frightened Jesuits, and boy, they were frightened, were brought into this harbor as the first white men, at least of record, to come in here. How do I know this? Now I'm going to mention a source to you I bet you not one of you has ever heard of. There's no reason particularly why you should, unless you're interested in history, but I think everybody in Oswego ought to know about them. This source is called the Jesuit Relations. Jesuits must keep a personal diary when they go out on mission duty. They've always had to do that, they still do. At that time, the Governor General was located in Paris, and so the Jesuits who were here and in Canada kept the date, and had to be a daily relation, and it had to be sent back to Paris. Guess what? One of our far-seeing librarians, who used to be here years ago, bought the 24 volumes that pertain to northern New York for the college library. Nobody knew they were there except me. Oh, you know, it makes me sound so wonderful. People say, oh, where did you find these things? God, I went to the library. It's incredible. You know, you think I've been digging and screwing. I haven't, because it hasn't been necessary. It's like shooting fish in a barrel, these speeches. It makes me sound like such an erudite scholar. I am, but not this particular way. So I went out there, and I knew she had gotten those books, and I started looking. Sure enough, there's a whole volume on Oswego and this area. And they described, these men were expected to give detail in their reports, and they did. So if you want to know, the American Encyclopedia and the Encyclopedia Britannica had for years used the Jesuit relations as the accurate account of what went on in early America. It wasn't given credit because it was Catholic. Let's be honest about these things. We finally got over that. Some of it we owe the Kennedys. It's, you know, I'm a Catholic. I'm not going to burn your house down or something like that. It's, you know, this kind of nonsense has gone on a long time. We finally got over that. Now of course, recognition is given for this source. It was the only accurate source because the Jesuits were the only ones who didn't have anything to gain. They weren't looking for the furs. They weren't out for anything at all. They were here on invitation. Now that you have to remember also. The Onondaga Indians had come in contact with them through the coming of Champlain, who came in at Pulaski, where the river comes in over there, 2 years before that. And the Indians had become acquainted with what they called the Black Robes. And they discovered that these men had some knowledge of medicine. And they could tell them things that would help their babies come better of the various illnesses that they had. So they wanted them to come, and they invited them. Go down to San Marie among the Iroquois. That's a wonderful exhibit. They tell you all this down there. And I was doing it before that. Here it is. They were invited to come. But Champlain wasn't coming with them. They were coming by themselves. Now stop and think about this, folks. Two men who carried no guns or traps or anything else, who sat in a canoe guided by two Indians, and they were brought into the harbor of Oswego in 1654. It took a lot of courage to do that, an enormous amount of courage. They were terrified because the harbor at that time was only as wide. The Fort Bluff is accurate. The Fort Bluff is pretty much the way it always has been. Not too much has been done to shave that away. But of course the other side of the river is somewhat changed. The original width of the river was as far as from the Fort Bluff to the section of the harbor where the museum sits. That part of the harbor was narrow at that time, narrower than it is now. The section where the Coast Guard is and all that was dug out later by the Army Corps of Engineers. But the river came empty there at the foot of the fort. Only it didn't empty to their view. It was covered, filled, chock full of reeds and rushes of various sorts. And the Indians started right into the rushes, and the Count, the Jesuit priest, Father Lesbitt was his name, he was terrified. He didn't know what was going to be in there, or what the Indians were going to do to them when they got in there. You know, people believed all kinds of weird stories about the animals that were here and all this kind of thing. They didn't know what was in there. So he described that the canoe wove its way, that's how he put it, wove its way in through, wove its way, through the rushes, and they seemed to go on forever. After I read this, I tried to figure out how far. It probably went, the depth of the rushes probably went as far as from where the Fort Bluff is, down the river to approximately the area where Admiral Woolsey's, I still call it that restaurant, is that section, all that section filled with rushes. So they kept traveling through this. But then he describes it, and finally we burst forth, he says, upon the sparkling waters of the river of the Onondagas, which is what they called the Oswego River at that time. And of course they proceeded down, and they were received with open arms, were loved and beloved by the Indians when they got down there. It was only after now get it straight, folks, the Jesuits didn't do anything except help. But as soon as the French got there, all hell broke loose, as it always did when the Europeans arrived among the Indians. But that's another story. That section, what went on at Fort, at the settlement. That wasn't a fort. It was an encampment, where San Maria among the Iroquois, that's been misnamed a fort. The French fort was not a fort, it was a settlement. And the Jesuits were there for several years until the French came and then made things impossible and they had to leave. That's an interesting story. Go down to that wonderful place. That's a terrific museum and see what they've done. Get that story. So the river was opened. And what did it look like? The description is absolutely magnificent. One of the priests says, I looked up and the sky was black with eagles. Nowadays, if one of them gets over here from the Montezuma Swamp, everybody runs out in the yard to look at it because it's such a rare thing. What happened to the eagles? Greed happened to them. Let's shoot an eagle and mount it in our library. Let's shoot an eagle and pluck the feathers. The Indians didn't do that. They had used the eagles. The eagle was a symbol of many of the tribes, and they had eagle feathers in their headdresses and so on. But only if the feathers fell out. They weren't killing them, plucking them out. You have to remember these things and you have to get your facts straight. He describes the sky as being black. Unfortunately, as soon as word got out, he said the two men sent their relations back to Paris, and the Governor General, I suppose, said something, or somebody did. Anyway, the word got out. And they also had the misfortune to say that the river at this point was teeming with beaver. That was their first big mistake. Because, of course, the greed again, when I was growing up, there was an old priest who ran the church in Baldwinsville. He gave an annual sermon, bless his heart, I've never forgotten it. He said there's just one sin and it's been responsible for the whole world, greed. And he was right. Just look at it. We want the oil, folks, in Iraq. Don't get me going on that one. That's what that's about. Don't make up any pretenses about it. That's what it's about. I'm older than you and I know it. So don't believe this crap that comes out of Washington. That's what it's about. Greed is behind that horrible thing. And so, people who were trappers and were involved in the fur trade said, aha, and over they came because beaver was highly regarded. Ermine, sable, mink had not come in to the attention of royalty at that time. And so what they wanted was the beaver. All robes, hats, cloaks, things of that nature in the royal houses of Europe were made of beaver. So the trappers came. You've seen all those movies. They always star James Stewart. You certainly must have seen him in his canoe with his beaver pelts behind him. Coming down out of the mountains of the West. Yes, the mountain men operated, but there was a big thing here. Nobody's made any movies about that. But the biggest spot for in the early years of this country for trade with the Indians in beaver was the Oswego Harbor. And hundreds of trappers and settlers came there trading with the Indians with the beaver. That brought other things with it, of course. It brought disease. The Indians never had measles in their lives. Then they did. Never had smallpox. Right away. It even got so bad in some parts of the country, down around Jamestown, for example, where in order to get rid of them, the traders wrapped the blankets of the smallpox victims, gave them to the Indians so they'd wrap themselves up in it and give them the smallpox. That's what happened down there. Those kinds of things are terrible blots, but you have to tell the story the way it is. You can't glorify these things. And there were mistakes and horrible mistakes made at the beginnings of the country. There were also wonderful, great things done, which I'm getting to. But this is what started it all. So, of course, right after that, settlement began. The trappers moved in, and little settlements, small settlements, we have sketches showing what it looked like here of the small cabins that stood along the west side of the river. Nobody settled over near Fort Ontario for obvious reasons. If you were in your right mind, you didn't settle next to a fort. And so, because the early settlement was on the west side. All of this continued until mainly trappers, explorers coming and going through the river until the 18th century. 1755, the French and Indian War broke out. The French and Indian War is now, mainly, people remembered, if they remember it at all, for Washington's expeditions along the Monongahela, and that's where he got his feet wet to become a commander, the leader that he was. Washington was on the job training. You know, you read all the glorious stuff about him later on, which is all very true. But how did he get to be what he was? Because he didn't run away on the Monongahela, that's why. A lot of the other troops did. They ran, but George Washington did not run. And as a result, he barely escaped being killed. But he remembered what he saw there, and it helped to shape his leadership qualities for later on. I always like to look and see what shaped these leaders, what made them what they were. And he was an extraordinary man. Of course, there's a little quality called genius that figures in here. We don't understand how that occurs in the gene pool, but nevertheless, also experience. Washington hung on at the Monongahela, and then on down to Fort Duquesne. So, what happened in the French and Indian War was that the French and the Indians, who were allied, mainly the Hurons from Canada, were allied with the French commanders, and the French wanted the English forts along the shores of Lake Ontario and the rivers. The commander who attacked Oswego, of course, was the Marquis de Montcalm, who, as early commanders go, was a pretty good man. He was understanding, and he was reasonably kind and decent. There were two forts here by that time. One, Fort Ontario, and the first fort. The first fort. Be a star at a cocktail party, because you'll know where the first fort was. Everybody thinks it's Ontario, but it isn't. The first fort was built in 1722 on the west side of the river, before West 1st Street, where the boulder stands now. That was Fort Oswego. It was an English fort, and it was across, 2 years later, Fort Ontario was built, so the two of them were across the river from each other. Fort Ontario was no masterpiece of fort building, but the little Fort Oswego was an absolute anomaly, and how it ever even stood up, I don't know. It was made of soft stone. And this struck me as very interesting. When I went to college, one of the first things I wanted to do was to try to find the easiest science I could take, since science was not my strong point. So I looked around and I thought, well, geology sounds pretty good. I think I can remember the rocks. So I took geology. I'm glad I did, because one of the first lectures we had was talking about the rocks that exist in the Oswego Basin. On the east side of the river, it's hard, wonderful, rigid limestone. Don't believe me, take a look at the fort. It's made of native limestone, which was quarried right below the bluff. If you peer over the bluff, even now, you can see the outcroppings of the limestone. But guess what's over on the other side? Soft sandstone. You could carve that with a jackknife. You could carve it, you still find little pieces of it. Why that happened, the geologists, of course, were fascinated by this wonderful thing. What happened? The river split the section, and this is what happened with the rocks. Well, anyway, I explained everything on exams and everything on the glacier. That must have been the reason. Yeah, it's a good way out. So, because they don't know what the answer is either. So, but that one was built, the little fort on the west side was built with this soft stone. You could literally almost push it over. Well, what happened when the French came down and attacked the forts was they took Fort Ontario like that. Then they mounted their ordnance on the Fort Ontario bluff and fired down on that poor little fort and smashed it without any problem whatever. It just fell in, literally. In that fort, that's what makes this story interesting, and where you need to know, or things you really need to know about it. There are accounts of that in all the histories, and the fort and the attack that took place. But let's find out what really happened, folks. Before that, the battle period, the English and the French were having a lot of trouble in this country because the soldiers, generally speaking, didn't like their service. Why would they? If you joined the army in those days, either of the big European armies, or for that matter, if you were impressed into it, which is what happened to most of them, you know how long foreign service was? 20 years. You're going to get back home to your wife and children? You bet you weren't. And so what was happening was that a lot of the men were defecting to the Indians. Life in the villages was rather nice out among the nations. There was plenty of food, the lodges were warm, the Indians were kind and pleasant people, and they left. A lot of them married Indian women. So the commanders had to do something about that. And so they made it possible for the men to bring their women and children over with them. Of course, the officers had always had this privilege. There's another whole speech about officers and their privileges, but we won't get into that right now. Thing is, they could, but the enlisted men had not been able to up until now. So they brought some of them, not everybody, but some of them brought their women and children. In reading the Oswego County history, accounts of this battle that took place in 1756, it's very detailed. In fact, the Oswego County history is one of the best, because all these county histories were published in 1876, the centennial anniversary of the founding of the country. And at that time, Oswego was the wealthiest city up here. Syracuse couldn't compare to it. So the people, it was ancestor worship. These people could afford a very elaborate history. And thank goodness they did, because ours is the best and the most detailed. Boy, every list of enlistment, men's names, the whole thing is in it. And it's a wonderful resource. Except, I am reading this account of 1756 back in 1976. And I said to my friend who was then the director of Fort Ontario, Wally, it seems to me there's something missing from this account. And he said, I thought smirking a little bit, well, it seems to me, Rosemary, you of all people ought to know what's missing. And I said, well, let's not play any games, what's missing? And he said, there is no mention of the women and the children. Bingo. There wasn't. Not a word. So we wrote. We wrote to the Tower of London. They keep England's military records there. We wrote to the Sorbonne in France. They keep the military records there. The English answered immediately. Thank God for the English. If they ever go down the tubes, we'll never have any history left, because they keep records of everything. You could even find out what Harold was carrying in his backpack in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings, for God's sake, if you go to the Tower of London. So they sent back immediately. They sent overleafs, overcovers, that you could use on a rear projector, showing the plans of the original fort, exactly where it was, so we could put it down over the present fort. The surprise is not that different. There is some of the old fort extends further into the parking lot than the present fort does, but not much. That's remained pretty much the same. They also answered our question. Were there women and children there? Yes, said the English. Approximately 69. The French, well, don't hold your breath while you're waiting for them to answer. They got around to it, but you know, life is easy in Paris. So they finally answered, and their answer was yes. They gave the number as being slightly in excess of 100. So Wally and I decided to go with a lesser number, not to be making it more than it was, since nobody knows the exact number, so we took the 69. That's enough, because of what happened. On the 15th of August, 1756, the battle was over, because that little fort just fell. And Montcalm and his men, he, as the commander, was on site at Fort Ontario. His second in command conducted the attack on Fort Oswego. Go down and read the boulder. It's interesting to me to watch people pass that by. Most people in Oswego never read it. You know what it says, that boulder, put up by the United States government? 5,000 French and Indians attacked that little fort, which had a garrison of 250 men. Some even odds. They swept over it, and they destroyed it. First, they hit the little hospital and killed all the men in there. Then, the Indians, who had been celebrating all night, burst out of their camp, and they conducted one of the worst massacres that has ever been seen on the American frontier. Now listen, folks, I have never in my life as a historian made a value judgment about anybody. And I'm certainly not about to start now with the Indians. It was a different culture, a different time. But of course, when you read these accounts, all you ever see is, oh, the Indians swept in and they did all of the massacring. No, they didn't. Certainly they were involved in it. But here's a little fact, ladies, that you might like to know, to credit the Indians. The Indians didn't rape, but the French soldiers did. Who do you suppose swept over that fort and raped those women? The French soldiers did. The Indians did not. We have an account, and it's kind of an interesting way I got it. After this investigation began, I got a letter from a man who was a professor of my rank at the University of Aberdeen, and he wrote to me and said that he wanted to come to Oswego to do some research on a man he had discovered had an early history connection with the city. So he came. Professor Frank Lyle, a more charming man you never met in your life. He talks like Sean Connery. Charming, charming man. He came. And he presented me with a copy of a diary kept by a man named Peter Williamson, or Indian Pete, as he was known on the frontier. Now what he was a soldier of fortune who just wandered around from camp to camp, but he had a very keen eye. And he was here when that massacre took place, and he described it. It's almost hard for me to put the words together to describe it. Arms and legs hacked off. Babies picked up by one foot and thrown against the wall. The women's breasts cut off. Unborn babies ripped from the womb. It goes on like that. This happened not in some remote place in the West where we have Wounded Knee and all kinds of events that was. Right here, folks, at the foot of the Oswego River, right here. And not one word in that historic account, in the history, not one word. So I said to Wally, why is this? There's no mention of this massacre. Why not? He said, I can guess, but we'll try to find out. So we did. We wrote to several scholars of the period and this kind of history. Guess why not? Because the very, very proper Victorian gentleman who wrote that history concluded that the only women who could possibly have been on the frontier were camp followers. Well, so what? They died, didn't they? And do you really think there were 69 women of the evening coming up here into the winter from New York and places like that? Of course not. Sure, there were camp followers. If that bothers you, you can't read about Caesar's Gallic Wars or any of the rest of it, because there's always camp followers. I'm waiting for the first article to come out about the Iraqi camp followers, because they're sure to be there. They are always there. The women are there. And there's ladies, I hope you're not offended by this, but there's a need for them. Come on. People you have to be realistic about these things. Moral judgments have no place with traveling armies around the frontier. They weren't, of course, all prostitutes. A great many of them were those women and children who had been allowed to come over and be with their husbands and fathers. Well, it doesn't matter to me what their professions were. They died, and they died miserably and horribly. And nobody even thought to put a word in an official history about it. The same thing happened at a small fort called Fort Cole, which is located just outside of Rome. They have that over there to their credit. The massacre is in their records of that little fort. Not very detailed, but it's at least there. And I always love to be able to tell that story, the one I have just told you, in a mixed crowd. Because may I remind you that there is no product without a consumer, gentlemen. So it's very important to remember that when you get all upset about the fact that they're mad by prostitutes on the frontier. Well, after that, well, it's true. And as I say, judgments have no place in an account like this. So I'm going to digress a little bit here to talk about leadership. 250 years had elapsed as of last year. It was the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Oswego. We owe a great deal to Paul Lear, who has started the reenactments at the fort and started calling attention to this in a military sense. But you got to thank me for the other, because I'm still trying to lead, even though I now have my cane. But it's really just a prop. I like the idea. You know what this is? It's a reproduction of Queen Victoria's cane. What could be more appropriate? One of my daughters got it for me, but I need it to a certain extent, but not as much as I pretend I do. Anyway, so nobody said anything. And for 250 years, women have lived in Oswego, or very close to 250 years, and not one word in any church group, in business and professional women, Zonta, or any of the rest of it, has ever been said about those women or any commemoration held, and so I started it. Last year we had the first. Mrs. Hallenbeck is with me. She's a good friend and she's my driver. She attended, and she can tell you, if you want to talk about it afterwards, about it. She attends these things. She's one of the women in the city who does. I held a ceremony at the boulder on the 15th of August to commemorate the death of these women. It was very simple. I read a part of what I just told you, but I didn't go into detail because there were children in the audience. But I also read, you see, Montcalm's conditions of surrender. And this is what he said. It's not an exact quote because I've got to bring it with me, but it's the substance of it. The military personnel are to be treated with respect. Those who are sutlers or other members of the mercantile community are to be treated with respect, as are the others who are in that camp. Who were the others he was talking about? He was talking about the women. Montcalm recognized it. But they weren't. The fact that his own men did not follow his instructions doesn't hold to the fact that he recognized those women were there and were supposed to be treated with respect. Now let me tell you a discovery. See, I'm always looking, always looking. It doesn't have to do with the Spiegel. But it's so wonderful, I have to share it. One of my daughters lives, what a spot for me. She lives halfway between Valley Forge and Gettysburg. I just love the time. Oh boy, every time I go down, she says, well, where will we go first? Gettysburg or Valley Forge? It depends on what's been going on in either one of the places. But anyway, we're over to Valley Forge the last time I was down, and guess what's happened? They have completely changed the exhibit area, which is a good thing, because what it was before was a series of tables with glass tops, you know those things. And in it they had things like this: a musket ball, a flintlock, and for God's sake, you know, table after table after. Didn't tell the story of Valley Forge, didn't begin to. For one thing, it confuses people. Valley Forge was not a battle; it's a campground. And I think when they say all this military stuff, people oftentimes think that. Didn't tell any story at all. It was just a lot of artifacts laid out. Well, somebody has gotten there who's changed things around, because guess what I found? They have changed the display areas, and in one of the display areas is the copy of a memorandum which was sent by George Washington and signed by him to one of his lieutenants. It says, among other things, he's asking for help because the men were sick and needed help. He asks that the women of Philadelphia be invited out. We all know about that they came. But then he adds, and please enlist the help of the women of the camp. Who do you think they were? And Washington recognized them. But he's never been given the credit for that. That's never been on display. 200 years it took to do that. I looked at that and I squealed out loud. My son-in-law said, what's the matter? And I said, where is the director of this place? So I did. I found the man who was in charge of security. I went to him. I said, I just got to tell you how pleased I am and how proud you should be. He said, Madam, you're not the first woman who's come in here. I said, I'm surprised. I'm sure I'm not. Well, of course they, who do you think nursed those men? For heaven's, well, the women of Philadelphia came, bless their hearts. Martha Washington didn't sit in that awful farmhouse, which was worse than the little cabins. She said, nursed them too. We've known about that. We've known about that. I embarrassed a young man over there so badly. This was before the new displays. I walked around down there one day, and a young guy, all dressed up in his colonial uniform, was giving a tour. And he's going on about the men and their bleeding feet and all the rest of it, which we know. I'm not making light of that. It was terrible. And when he got through, I shouldn't have done it, I suppose, but I couldn't resist. He said, are there any questions? I raised my hand. I said, yes. What about the women? And he just stood there. Some man in the background said, right on, lady. I said, the women who were here and who nursed the men, you aren't mentioning them, young man. Think about it. Afterward, I went up and apologized to him. I said, I didn't mean to embarrass you, but you must start. He said, I really didn't know. I said, you get in there and get those people to tell you about it. I take a little credit. Maybe I was responsible for those things being put up at me. I told him what he needed to know. You can't do that. You cannot, in a place like Valley Forge, editorialize and cut out things. You can't do it. You have no right. And I was shamed, and I said in my first little ceremony we had at the Rock 2 years ago, shame on you, women of Oswego. Shame on you. 250 years gone by, and I'm not even a native, and no mention of these women, and no ceremony to honor them. Well, we've had two. There'll be another one next year. Please find the time on the 15th of August at 7 o'clock in the evening to come down there. Our little ceremony only lasts a half an hour, little enough time to give considering the sacrifice. Please come. I want to see more and more people. I got a note, I got a fan letter after the first ceremony. Guess who it was from? A man, bless his heart. And he said, I want to thank you. I stood there and thought about those innocents who were sacrificed, and I thank you for doing this. And I thought, well, bless you. No woman did, but he did. I'm ashamed of the women of Oswego. I'm ashamed. We would have the ERA amendment, ladies, we would have that by now if we had a historic base. But listening to Gloria Steinem is not going to help. That's what was wrong with it, all right from the start. You didn't talk about the women who helped found this country, you talk about women like that who don't like men. And that's not the way to do this. Not at all. So, I want to tell you about today are the things of in this city that are important to remember. We don't forget the men at the fort. You couldn't forget them. That's a wonderful display over there. Paul Lear's doing a marvelous job. And no one is trying to take anything away from that, but you have to remember the others who were involved. We move on from the French and Indian War to the War of 1812, where my husband's family comes into it. My grandchildren's great, 5 grades back, grandfather was a little boy of 12 when that attack came. And some of you must have read by now, or at least heard of the Great Rope. I've been making time on that ever since I wrote it 30 years ago. Because it has become a textbook in many of the schools. I got a fan letter from a little boy in Hawaii who had had that book as part of his 4th grade local history study. And I'm very proud and glad that that's the case. Because it tells what happened in Oswego in 1812. We all know about Andrew Jackson's great victory in New Orleans. Unfortunately, it took place 2 weeks after the peace had been signed, but nevertheless, it was a victory. Ours didn't come at that time. It came in the bloodiest part of the War of 1812. The fort was attacked, and it was knocked down by the British troops attacking it. But what happened was, again, the ingenuity and courage of the frontier people. A great rope, main anchor cable for the ship Superior, had been built. The ship had been built at Sackett's Harbor, and the rope, the main anchor cable, 450 feet long, 22 inches in circumference. I know it was because I wrote to the Navy Department to get the right, to be sure I was right when I wrote this, and that's what it was. And it weighed short, just under 3 tons. They had to get that up to Sackett's Harbor. It was stored just below us. It got as far as Fulton. Couldn't get any further with it, and the war broke out. So the brave men of Oswego took 19 bateaux. You know what those are? They're the large, well, they look like a big rowboat, only they will take a sail. It's a Durham boat. They're called Durham boats. And if you are familiar with the portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware, that's what he's riding in, a Durham boat. He would say, oh, that's not an accurate painting because he couldn't have stood up. Yes, he could. People stood up in the Durham boats. I get so angry at this kind of ignorant remark by people who don't know. The Durham boats had a platform running around the edges, and the men stood and used the interior for cargo space. Well, they took 19 of those, loaded the great rope into one of them, and my children's little grandfather, 12 years old, got to go along. And we had the family account of it. And they got that rope up there, and it was placed on the Superior, chased the British back to Kingston, and the war was over the next spring. Not one word of that, not one word of it anywhere in the city's history teaching until I wrote that little book. Incredible to me, absolutely incredible. All this glorious history, and the great rope is unique. Nobody else did anything like that anyplace. So we passed that. We have, as you noticed, I skipped over the Revolution because the British held the fort during the Revolution activity here, as far as the settlers were concerned. So we pass 1812. We begin to settle. We begin to settle here. We begin to come in. It's been freed up with safety. And the next big step is the Underground Railroad. Oswego was one of the great places for the Underground Railroad. Black people escaped down the Erie Canal and then took passage to Canada, right out of the Oswego Harbor. I have a display that pleased me very much because after the Jerry rescue monument was built in Syracuse, the black gentleman who was chairman of the committee came down to Oswego to look at, he'd heard about our display, and he came down and congratulated me for having done it. And he invited me to the dedication ceremonies, which I was very happy to go to. What happened there, Jerry was a slave who had escaped, who came to Syracuse. He was a cobbler. He had a little shoe business. The slave hunters finally caught up with him. And he was thrown into the jail, which is right there on Clinton Square, where there now is, of course, a parking lot. The old jail was there, right across from where the Soldiers and Sailors Monument is today. But the people of Syracuse, who were dedicated to this, rescued him. Again, the cleverness of these people. They got a double span, double hitch, 12 pairs, double hitch gray horses, and hitched them to identical matching wagons. And then they put Cherry in one of the wagons and spread out all over the city with the others. Of course, the authorities didn't know which one was Cherry, so they got him away, brought him to Mexico. He was hidden there for a while and then smuggled under the floor of a wagon here and took ship for Kingston from Oswego, where he lived a successful life after that. There were many, many people here who participated. There are several hiding places still existed in the city. We recreated one of them in the museum. We found it in a house across the river, a blind wall, behind it a hiding place where somebody who had been hidden in their escape. Black people were treated with great kindness and understanding. At one time on the Pease farm, which is just to the west of the city, there were 100 escaped slaves working there. The slave hunters gave up because the Peases wouldn't give in, and therefore they were allowed to work until they moved on elsewhere. Then we have the establishment of education here. Edward Austin Sheldon, who went to Switzerland, met the Pestalozzi family who invented the new method of teaching, and he brought it back here, and it began in the United States here. Every one of you, where you went to school, it doesn't make any difference. You are a student of Edward Austin Sheldon, because he brought the object method of teaching from Switzerland and the Pestalozzis to Oswego. What is the object method of teaching? In the old days, you went to school in a one-room schoolhouse or more than one room, and the teacher stood up in front and said, A, and you said A. They were called blab schools, because that's what you did. You blabbed back the lesson. The teacher said it, they did that. But Edward Austin Sheldon walked up in front of his little class one day and held up an apple. You see that in the statue, which is in front of the college. And he said, "What's this?" And some little kid said, it's an apple. Yes, but what else is it? It's a globe, somebody said. Yes, what else? It's a sphere. Do you know any other things that are shaped like this? The sun, the moon. The kids started, as children always do, recognizing that it was an object, not just an apple, but an object. The object teaching of children began in Oswego, and it began in a little storefront down on West First Street, where the kids sat on the floor because there was nothing. He went around to the wealthy Brahmins of the city, but they wouldn't contribute anything. So Sheldon did the best he could with what he had. And out of it grew the State University. Also, out of it grew a method of instruction that we take for granted today. There's one more story I want to tell you because it's out of sequence, but it is important to your understanding of this place and what it represents in the history of our country. Once the revolution was over, the British were out of here, the men who served in the revolution were, as I presume you know, I hope you do, that they were all given land grants afterwards. The country was chopped up and men got so much land and farms and so forth afterwards. There was a man named Asa Rice who got a land grant up here. Rice Creek is named for him. So he brought his family up here to claim his land in the fall of 1799. He He came down the river in October. When I tell this story to elementary school classes, there's always some little kid who raises a hand and says, didn't he know what the winter was going to be like? And I'll say, yeah, well, maybe yes, maybe no, but if you had waited 11 years, it took 11 years for those grants to come through, you know why? Because the British wouldn't leave the forts on the lake. They stayed right in Oswego for 11 years. And so this and all the way. Rochester, they didn't want to go. We didn't have any standing army. Everybody went home after the revolution, so these guys decided to stay. But when they finally left in 1799, I said, that's why this man brought his family. He finally got his land. There was Asa Rice, his wife, a boy who was about, I guess, I can figure it from the gravestone, probably about 12 or 13, and a baby, a newborn. So in October they came down the river and they turned west and they crossed, you know where Rudy's is? Most people do. Past Rudy's and on out to where the road crosses the water. That little body of water is Rice Creek. And he turned off the lake, up Rice Creek, and went up about 60 yards and started to build his cabin. He got the floor in and he got the side stringers up. And then in early November, an event happened that strikes fear into the hearts of us even now today. I know all this because Mr. Rice's diary is in the Historical Society, and he recounts what happened. They were hit by a snowstorm, November 5th. And I can tell from the description it was lake effect, that's what it had to be. So he had a tarpaulin with him, he covered the stringers with a tarpaulin. They got a circle of stones, which he put on the floor. He didn't have the floor in, it was the mud beaten down, the dirt floor, so he built a little circle fireplace. And he and his wife and the two children started out to spend their first winter 30 yards off Lake Ontario under a tarpaulin. His account for February 2nd, 1800 is as follows. My wife and I stood all night long, holding the baby between us. But in the morning he was dead, frozen. My God. Some of you have children. If you don't, know people who do. I've thought of that story every time one of my children was born. I thought, how could those people have stood that? No wonder about Mrs. Rice. She had no one to talk to. She couldn't talk to her husband. He was as stricken as she was. Her nearest neighbor was 175 miles away in Albany. She could have thrown up her hands and just said, take me away from this place. I don't want to see it. Or she could have succumbed. I don't know if you all know this, but cabin fever is mental illness, which struck the frontier, was occasioned by women being stuck alone in those cabins. And oftentimes just because they were alone, not when something horrible like this has happened. But she didn't do any of those things. She stayed right there. The next spring, they planted their fields, and then they moved further deeper. There's their house still standing deeper on in the county. They had ultimately 6 more children, and they lived to be leading citizens of that county, of the county. The Germains live there now, and they've been my friends for a long time. So I got permission from them, and so every Memorial Day, while my children were still at home, we'd get in our canoe, and we'd go up to the mouth of Rice Creek, and down the creek in the canoe, to the backyard of the Germain house, because the foundation of that cabin is there, still there. And behind it is a little grave plot. It's about as big a round square as this area right here. A stone wall around it, and there are 4 gravestones. Mr. and Mrs. Rice, who requested to be buried there rather than in the new cemetery at the time, so they were returned to that spot. A boy who died when he was 14, it doesn't say of what, but probably one of the illnesses that took children in those days. That other little grave. Asa Rice, Jr., aged 6 months. I took my children there, not out of any morbid curiosity or anything like that. I took them there because I wanted them to know just how dearly the playing fields over by the fort where my son played Little League ball, just how hard it was to win that stretch of lake where the girls went canoe surfing all the time, just how hard it was to win that strip of land where Rudy's is and everything it lies. People paid for that. and they paid dearly. You can't walk a mile, an inch in Oswego, not anywhere, and not step on a sacred spot. Sir William Johnson's daughter, Holly Johnson, fled the Mohawk Valley in 1777 because, of course, her father was a leader of the Loyalist faction. She got as far, in the winter, she had to flee. She was pregnant. She got as far as Fort Ontario, where the baby was born, and they both died. She was buried with her baby someplace on the fort grounds, out in the cemetery. They didn't mark it in the Moe station, never marked a grave. It was too dangerous to do that. Somebody could desecrate it. But the next time you go over there to look at the water, watch a child play ball, Holly's there. So she was a royalist, a loyalist. So what? She was a woman who had nothing whatever to do with the war or causing it, who sacrificed in the American Revolution on that spot. There's a great deal to be remembered in Oswego and a great deal of debt to be paid. These people must be remembered. It is justice that they be remembered. It has nothing to do with morbid curiosity or anything like that. It has to do with justice. And so I charge you, leaders of tomorrow, when you see something, I'm very glad, I'm getting older, but I still set up that ceremony to honor the women of 1756 because it's my job as the city historian. If nobody else is going to do it, I am, as long as the cane will let me crawl around. You must take these things seriously, and you must honor those who came before. They gave this to you. Those valiant women in 1756, it was only 20 years to 1776. They knew there was a new wind blowing. They lost that battle, but they won the war for us. The French and Indian War is now being called the first step in the American Revolution. They won that battle for us, the long battle. So did everybody else I've told you about. Their sacrifices on the frontier to start the country. America is an extraordinary place for many, many reasons. But one of the things that bothers me is that we honor, and we should, we honor the men who wrote the Constitution. What a miracle that was. We honor George Washington, we honor Lincoln, all these people, we should. But George Washington rode from Mount Vernon up to Crown Point after the Revolution. I bet you didn't know that, but he did. And he thanked people all along the way. And he said, things would have been very different for me where I was fighting had it not been for you on this western frontier. He knew it, and he thanked them, and he recognized it. It's the least we can do. So please bear these things in mind and remember that with your leadership comes responsibility. And I hope, I'd like to hand the torch, as it were, over to you to do these things. And look around. There's lots to be done still. It doesn't end with all of these things. So, telling the stories is a way to keep it alive. You can't shake hands with George Washington and tell him thank you. But by telling his story and keeping it alive, that's our way of giving thanks. Thank you.
The thing that we did in the planning department put more money in it because we didn't want, nothing wrong with habitat houses, but we didn't want vinyl siding houses down there. And we wanted the houses not to look like a stigma of low to moderate income. So we put, you know, a lot of different architectural reliefs on these things. We put porches on them. We used hardy plank, which is a cement board siding. We did all these things. So we put another $15,000, $20,000 in the exterior so they would fit into the neighborhood. So we did a lot of things like that. But we were able to get most of them through the home program. And you have to remember, we were 70% rental, so there wasn't a lot of home ownership down there. Most of the people that were getting out of there were the slumlords, and they would come to us wanting to sell their property because inspection was going down there and doing it. So there was both of those things going on at the same time. If they fixed them up, we were okay with that. But here's the thing, even the slumlords are making money down there, big money down there. When they're selling. And we always got appraised value when we bought from the slumlords, and we gave them probably a little bit more than appraised value almost every time because we never wanted to be seen as that we were pushing them out of there. So they always made more money than really what they should have done. That was important.
Yes. I didn't know if anybody in the room happened to know how many rental properties there are in the city of Oswego. I was just wondering. Thank you. I didn't know if somebody had a direct
There are a little over
percentage.
7,000 residential properties, and I would say about 35% are rental properties.
What was that percentage?
35%.
Thank you. Yes.
Terry Mannion. I think more to the point, what this gentleman was talking about was, where do those people who are, through no fault of their own, poor, wind up when, not gentrification, just when the properties become worth more to someone else? I've lived in 3 different cities, Omaha, Newburyport, and Amesbury, Massachusetts, where they were factory towns. Amesbury is virtually identical to Fulton in a lot of respects. When I go back there now to visit, the places that used to be storefronts are now attorneys and money managers' offices, and what used to be a newspaper store is now a very nice restaurant. But so many people that used to live there don't live there anymore. The people that go back 4, 5, 6 generations in that town, the people that built the town, their parents were the mill workers that built those towns. They can't live there anymore. The places they used to pay $400 or $500 a month to live in are now $2,000 a month, and they simply are gone. I'm not saying that development's bad. What I'm saying is that you really do create the perception that you're trying to get rid of the people who grew up there, in a lot of cases.
And I think the perception, you have to understand with the home program, these people are paying on the basis of what their income is, and it always stays that way. So they're not paying when the property values go up, they're still paying the same amount that they've always paid. So and then you have to understand, Paducah, Kentucky is not a property tax-based community. It is a payroll tax-based community, and which is very smart in a lot of ways, because Paducah swells to 80 to 100,000 people during the day. So these people that are using a lot of the services and goods and everything else in there are paying payroll tax, which is how, Paducah, the city of Paducah takes, and I think what they get in property taxes is about 7% of their budget. 7%. So my property taxes on a 3,000 square foot storefront were $698 a year.